So hello, everybody. Benoit already introduced BlackRock, so I won't do that. But I want to say a few words about myself. I'm interested in technology, but I also studied industrial design, and so that's where my love for front-end development comes from. But I'm also interested on the technology side, right? So today I'm going to talk about Monorepo and how and our experience with it. But before that, I would like to recommend these 3 books. These are excellent books, have nothing to do with computer science or JavaScript, in fact, but they deal with how the human brain works, which is usually described as a machine, so that's why I particularly like them. The first 2 are dealing with our wakeful mind, and the third one describes what our brain is doing while we're sleeping. Okay, so today, first we're going to take a look at what is a monorepo and what the technology promises. And then from there on, I'm going to talk about the problems that we faced while trying to adopt a monorepo. Okay, so on a nice sunny day, not like the days we have currently, you feel very confident with your choice. And just to validate that you made the right choice, you go to your fellow backend developers and say something like this to them. Okay, so we decided to do a monorepo, and it's a great idea. What do you think? And they will look a bit weird and say something like, are you out of your mind? We just got rid of the monolith, right? It took us 2 years to break it down into microservices. And you want to do this monorepo. It doesn't sound right. So indeed, the words are very similar. And I think to some extent, they are trying to solve the same problem, which is how to effectively reuse code between multiple functionalities. But the monolith is usually one large system that is deployed into one large application, and it evolved organically to be like that. People started with something simple, and then they added more and more and more. And the primary reason behind that was that infrastructure costs were high. So provisioning a new server and then building up the continuous integration process and those things used to be hard or used to take a long time. Now, that's the past, hopefully. But on the other hand, the monorepo is something different, where from day one, you are putting code into the same repository that deliver different functionality, but these building blocks, as you can see here, we can call them libraries, but they are independent and they are combined into multiple different applications that are deployed independently from each other. But these applications can effectively share the same code. So this is how it looks like. On the top, you see, so this is one Git repository, right? On the top, and in fact, it was generated with Angular CLI and a tool that I'm going to talk about later. And on the top, you can see the applications. There's multiple applications. In this example, there's 3 applications, and there's 2 end-to-end test applications. And then right after that, we have the libraries. So I'm going to refer to these as libraries because just to be consistent with what Angular CLI generates here. So each of these libraries can contain an Angular module. An Angular module is already something that encapsulates code, but what's important here is that we have this index.ts in the src folder, which exports everything that is public within this library. So in our case, most of the time it just exports the Angular module, but can also export other things like plain old TypeScript files for data model and so on. Okay, so you might say that there's already a solution to this problem, how to reuse code in JavaScript, right? It's called the npm package. Now, the problem with npm packages is that there's a lot of overhead. So consider a case where you have some common problem, like Webpack, or well, that's yeah. So Webpack is not the problem, right? The problem that Webpack solves is the common problem, and to some people Webpack is a problem, but there's a common problem that that people solved in a way, and then a lot of people are using it. But Webpack has a high maintenance cost. It's a complicated system, but it has a high number of downloads. So that's what you can see on the x-axis of this diagram. And on the y-axis, you can see the cost of maintenance. So Webpack has high number of downloads, and it has high cost of maintenance. isArray is a nice little npm package. It has 18 million downloads in a week. So it's amazing. It's one line of code. It has a low cost of maintenance, but still is a problem that many people are facing. So for these things, it's worth doing an npm package, and it's worth the cost of maintenance. On the other hand, your company probably is developing multiple web applications, and they have things in common. So one of those could be the design system, so the visual components. And then you can even have some code that you want to reuse between two different applications. And because of that, you put it in a separate internal npm package. But the question is it worth doing it? So let's take a look at an example where we have two different applications. And here you can see the timeline with the releases and the version numbers. And then we have the design system. So what you can see here is that application 1 has its 1.5.0 release. And just before that, design system came out with the 1.3.0. And the design system guys actually developed the component that was long awaited, the data grid, right? A common problem. But application 1, they had no time, and they did their own implementation, right? So in 1.5, they're using their own implementation, although there is one from the design system. Now, application 2, in version 2, they already adopted the data grid from the design system, and it's working very nicely. And application 1, meanwhile, had a minor patch release, but they haven't adopted the data grid because it was too much of a work, and that was just a quick fix. So they are still not using the one from design system. Then, in 1.6, they finally start using it from the design system, and actually they're using the newest version from the 1.3.1 version of the design system. But application 2, although they are using it from the design system, in their patch release, they are not upgrading to the newest version because they don't want to deal with that. So as you can see, at any point of time, there's inconsistency between the two applications. And that's just one of the problems, but there's a number of other problems. So for these npm packages, you have to set up all the Git repositories, the continuous integration process. You have to publish the packages into an internal package repository. It's always a problem to develop together the design system with an application. So design system is developed separately. And they probably have their own demo page for the components, but you don't see them in context in the application. So if the two teams overlap, they have to first publish to an internal NPM and then use it in the application and see how it looks like. And I already talked about the problem of how you upgrade to the next version. Now, in this scenario, it's up to the application developers to actually upgrade to the newest version of the design system. And if they don't do that, then tough luck, you have to maintain a previous version. So in contrast, in a monorepo, you have all this code in one repository. So that is a bit different, because then you can always be on the latest version of the design system, but it's the design system developer's responsibility to not break your code. So that means then in the monorepo, you actually have to have a lot of unit tests and all kinds of tests, in fact. And if you don't have the tests, you risk breaking your application because somebody else modifies this library. So this could be a downside, or this could actually be a good thing because you have to do tests. But anyhow, it's very dangerous not to do tests if you want to reuse the code, that is. OK, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how kind of we applied the monorepo to our problem. Here's a sample application that is supposed to work on desktop and supposed to work on the phone. Now, the desktop version is a bit different because on the desktop, you have the list of items, whatever they are, on the left. And on the right, you see the detail for one item. So if you click an item, the details will be displayed next to it. It could be an email client or something else as well. On the phone, you have two different pages. So you have the list page, and if you click an item, it will display the details. So for this talk, with some help of my colleagues, I developed this application because everybody loves SpaceX. And this application lists the rocket launches of SpaceX and can display some detailed information about them. It's a very nice application. It's out there on GitHub, and I will give you the URL at the end of the talk. OK, so one more thing. In the GitHub, there's also a backend that is using Nest.js and GraphQL. So if you're interested in that, you can take a look. It's a very simple implementation. So hopefully, this pattern is familiar to everybody, right? This is how we like to structure our Angular code. There are presentation components. There are container components. And the presentation components, they are responsible to render the data. They communicate with inputs and outputs. And then there's container components, and the container components are responsible to manage the state or get the data for the presentation components. You can see the arrows. This forms a nice one-way data flow. So, of course, once you go to presentation components, you then don't introduce any container components. So, but there can be more presentation components, and there can be more container components. So let's apply this pattern to the demo application. On the desktop, it would look something like this. So there's one combined page that can display the list and the details. And from this line downward, you have the presentation components. And in between these two lines, you have the container components. And on the phone, it looks a bit different because there's two separate pages, one for the list and one for the details. Right? It's fairly simple. If you take a look at this thing, you can identify components that are exactly the same. So the ones that have the same color are actually the same thing. What is different between these are the black ones, so these things. This is what is different between the desktop and the phone. Now, if this was one responsive application, right, that you normally do, then you would probably have to introduce some kind of control structures to, based on the device, to do either this or that, right? It cannot be done like, I wouldn't do it with responsive CSS or something like that. Of course, the details page can still be a responsive page that can be displayed on the desktop and on the phone in different sizes. But there is a difference. So the Monorepo helps you with this. Because in the Monorepo, you can actually have two different applications. One for the desktop and one for the phone. And in these two different applications, you only need to include the code that is specific to that application. So if you combine all these things, then this is what you will end up with. You have one application for the desktop, you have another application for the phone, and they are reusing a lot of things, except the page that is the container page that is different on the phone and on the desktop. Sounds really nice, right? So now I'm going to talk about the challenges that we faced. So we have something similar in our Monorepo, except that we have multiple applications, not just one. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is how you scale up. So what happens, if there's multiple applications in your Monorepo? Then I'm going to talk a bit about collaboration and how that is different from maybe a project that is specific to one application in one repository. And then I'm going to talk about, at the end, a bit about how you need to think differently so that you can really use the benefits of the Monorepo. So as I mentioned, you can have more applications. In this diagram, you see that application 1 and application 2 is there, and then we also have the server part here. Now, this is really good because you can reuse the data model. Actually, what happens is that Apollo server is generating the TypeScript classes that are then reused by the front-end application. So it's a really nice benefit that you get. But, if you have more applications, the build time will take longer because, what you can do is that you build every application in your continuous integration process, and that can take longer and longer with every new application that you introduce. So kind of what you expect is that if you change that piece of code, then what happens is that these two things are going to be tested, right? Because application 1 depends on page, and page is going to be tested. So these two things need to be tested, and all the other things can be left out from the testing. And what you pretty much want to do is to rebuild application 1, because the changes that you made were specific to application 1. If you change something like in the data model, then obviously you have to rebuild everything. So there is a nice tool that can help you with this. It's called NX. It's developed by ex-Google people. They're very nice. I actually met them. And they are developing these tools that sit on top of Angular CLI. They have their own schematics that you can do, and it has a number of benefits. So it can do incremental testing because it figures out the dependencies. So this diagram was actually generated by the tool for the sample application that I did. For example, if you have a pull request, you can use the NX tool to figure out what it needs to test and rebuild. And you don't have to have separate continuous integration processes for every application. You just have one, and the tool figures out what to do for you. So it can also do parallel builds. So if you need to rebuild multiple applications, it can do it much faster. It can help you with scaffolding your components. And what's nice about the NX tool is that they have a way to generate configuration for Jest instead of Jasmine. And by default, it generates configuration for Cypress for end-to-end testing. And recently, they also started to support React. So that's a nice addition. OK. So collaboration. So I think this must be the hardest part in the whole thing. Back when I studied computer science, one of my professors said that actually, when applying the theory, the problem is that you have no good example. And back then, I thought that, well, yes, because computer science is still young, and we'll figure it out in time. But the thing is that now I know that this is not going to change, because technology is changing maybe every month. There's a new thing. So there's no good examples. But in the monorepo, you need to be consistent, because otherwise, a lot of people that are working in the same repository will not be able to figure out what the others are doing. So what you need to do is to kind of think ahead and agree on rules. Possibly from day one, you won't be able to do that. Because it's very hard to anticipate what the whole monorepo will turn out to be. So we started out with one application, then we added another application, then another application, and then there were applications that were kind of the same, like in my example, but then there was another application that was a bit different. So on different level, we had to define what are the structure and what are the parts that are reused between the different applications. And actually, this is another area where using tools like NX will help you. So Angular CLI already can generate the components, and it can create the directory structure for you. NX is even better in that regard. With just for a reference, currently we think that this would be the best structure for us. As you can see, we have nested directories, and we're trying to push down the actual libraries to the lowest possible level. So we have, application 1, and then we can have application 2, and application 1 and the desktop and phone version are using their shared components from here, and then application 2 deal with that differently, and then there's a shared directory that is there for every application. So pretty much on every level, you need to agree on some standards that you all will follow. And it's hard because in our monorepo, there's more than 20 people contributing. And so, it's pretty much the same for normal projects. You kind of need to agree on things, but the stakes are much higher because here you add more and more. And if you don't follow the rules, it's going to be chaos. And to help that, I think you need to have a good way to share the knowledge or share the best practices. So you kind of will figure out eventually how to do things right. But when you do, you need to spread the word. So what we do is we set aside some time on every Friday to do demos. And one good way to figure out who is going to talk is then when you are doing the code reviews, you can flag a code as a candidate for the demo on Friday. And then that way, it's not up to the person who actually wrote the code, but it's up to the reviewers to figure out who's going to do the demo on Friday, or, well, can be multiple people as well. OK. So one more example why or how you need to be thinking a bit differently. Here I'm going to refer to the books. So the human brain is very efficient. It evolved to be very efficient. So what it does is, if you face a problem, you kind of search in your memories and find a solution instantly, right? So you do what you normally do. And that's a problem, because you need to do things a bit differently in the monorepo. So consider this problem. This problem. One day, your designer comes with this great idea that these cards should have a quick action. And indeed, that's a great idea. Why not? The problem is that it's going to be different on the phone and on the desktop. So on the phone, you need to swipe these cards, because that's what you're used to. And on the desktop, we will have the quick action as kind of a button there on these cards. So yes, that means that from this component, you have to have two versions. Now, by default, what do you do? If this was one application, you probably would introduce some kind of control structures here, an if, right? If the device is the phone, then we use the touch version. And if it's a desktop, we use the desktop version. And yeah, but there are a couple of problems with that. First of all, if there's multiple things that you need to decide here, then the code is going to be very complex. You end up with one component that does multiple things, but some of them don't belong to that device. Plus, you might end up with unnecessary dependencies that are going to be bundled with your application. So for example, we're using Hammer.js to handle the touch gestures. And that is unnecessary on the desktop, because you just don't use it. And the other thing is that because this is a presentation component, this probably has to have an input. And the input will tell which device you're on. But the input will come from probably this component. And this component will get it from a service, right? That's the Angular way. Because this is still a presentation component. This is still a presentation component. So this component, this is where you will query the service, and it will return the device type, and you will pass it down here, and then here you will do the if. So that's terrible. Instead, what you can do in the monorepo, you have the advantage that you have two different applications for the two different devices, right? So it has to be possible, right? So you start a sync, and one solution would be to do this. You can, first of all, you implement the touch version, and you implement the desktop version. You can even do a bit better and have a common part for the card, and then have a behavior extension, so to say, for the desktop and for the phone. And then what you do is you just duplicate this module, which is just a configuration. So what you do is you will end up with different configuration for the desktop and the phone, and you don't duplicate the actual component here, right? So you import here on the desktop, you import the desktop version of the list item, and here you import the phone version of the list item. And with something like that, you can solve all of these problems of not having to duplicate the code. The components will be simple and focusing on what they should do, and you don't include unnecessary dependencies. All right, so that's all. Thank you. Here's the URL for the sample code. And if you do something like this, I challenge you to think before you write an if.